John. Exciting stuff, isn't it? Look, I want to begin by talking about one of my old favourite TV shows. I haven't watched it for quite a few years, but one of my old favourite TV shows was The West Wing. I don't know if you've seen it. It's a very fast-paced, very witty drama about a fictitious US president named Jed Bartlett. Now, being Hollywood, okay, in this show, the bleeding heart liberals are the heroes of the show, and the social conservatives are the baddies of the show, but the real baddies are the religious conservatives. All right, you just need to know this going into the show. And look, for the most part, I could cope with that, but there was one episode that really upset me as a Christian, and it had the president basically berating a fictitious Christian radio talk show host, a female, in front of 24 other White House guests. And the reason he takes issue with this lady is because of her beliefs, such as that homosexuality is an abomination. And she replies by saying, look, I don't say homosexuality is an abomination, Mr. President, the Bible does. And the president says, yes, it does, Leviticus 18:11, which, by the way, we're preaching on next week. Malcolm will miss out. But then he says, look, I've got some other questions of you, and he fires them off in front of the crowd. And so the first one is, look, I'm interested in selling my daughter into slavery as is sanctioned in Exodus 21:7. What would be a good price for her? Question 2, my chief of staff insists on working on the Sabbath. Exodus 35:2 clearly says he should be put to death. Am I morally obligated to stone him myself? Question 3, touching the skin of a dead pig makes one unclean. Leviticus 11:7. That's our passage today. If they promise to wear gloves, can the Washington Redskins still play football this weekend? And number 4, can I burn my mother in a small family gathering for wearing 2 different types of thread? This is what he's saying in front of these people. Now, the argument he's making is a very common argument among opponents of Christianity. And that is that if Christians are going to hold to homosexuality being a sin, why don't they also hold to things like the Sabbath laws and the cleanliness laws? Like, are Christians just cherry picking? Okay? Christians seem to choose some laws that we're going to follow, the laws we like, and the ones we don't like, well, we just chuck out. And the passage we're looking at today, now we've only read some of a chapter today, but our passage today actually covers Leviticus chapter 11 all the way to Leviticus chapter 15, okay? And this is one of the sections that the Christian church seems to have chucked out altogether. I mean, hands up if any of what was just read to us was even remotely familiar, all right? We seem to have thrown that out of our life altogether. So here's the question, are we cherry picking as Christians? Do we cherry pick the Bible? Or is there something deeper going on here that our opponents and maybe we ourselves don't understand properly, right? What is the place of the Old Testament cleanliness laws in the life of the Christian church? And that's what we're looking at today. Now, this is the third in our series of Leviticus so far, and there are 2 main things we've been learning when it comes to Leviticus. So the first is this book, the message of this book is about how a perfectly righteous and holy God can dwell among sinful people, and those sinful people not be incinerated instantly, like Nadab and Abihu were in last week's passage. But second, as Malcolm mentioned before, Leviticus is arguably the most direct signpost to Jesus in the whole Bible. If you and I want to know about Jesus, then we need to read Leviticus and understand Leviticus. And Leviticus 11 to 15 is arguably the biggest and brightest signpost to Jesus. It's like these cleanliness laws are like the Vegas-style bright flashing neon light pointing to Jesus. All right, that's what we're looking at today. And I've got 3 points to help us see this. So we're going to begin by looking at the details of these cleanliness laws and how they were ridiculously difficult. So I've titled this first point, The Staggering Burden of Cleanliness. The Staggering Burden of Cleanliness. We're then going to look at the purpose of these cleanliness laws, which is point 2, the desperate need for cleansing. That's what the purpose of them is to point to our desperate need for cleansing. We're then going to conclude with our application, which is how exactly these Old Testament cleanliness laws fit into the life of the Christian church. And I've titled that The Wonderful Freedom of Being Cleansed. But our purpose for today is to look at the what, right? Then the why, and then the how of the cleanliness laws to show that Christians don't actually cherry pick the Bible. Believe it or not, we follow it all. So please come with me as we look at the staggering burden of cleanliness, the desperate need for cleansing, and the wonderful freedom of being cleansed. All right, so far, the book of Leviticus has shown us that if sinful people want to come before a perfectly righteous and holy God, we first need atonement of sin through sacrifice, that's chapters 1 to 7, and we need a mediator, a priest, that's Leviticus 8 to 10. The third thing we need, and this is Leviticus 11 to 15, is cleanliness. But this is not physical cleanliness, like taking a physical bath, though that's part of it. It's ritual cleanliness. All right? What this means is there are certain things that disqualify sinful people like you and I from coming before Yahweh. And when I say certain things, I mean 5 whole chapters worth. All right? 11 to 15. Now, we can only skim through them today, but I recommend going and reading them for yourself when you get home. But the first thing that disqualifies Israelites from coming before Yahweh is eating certain foods. So in Leviticus chapter 11, we get a whole list of foods that the Israelites are and are not allowed to eat. Certain foods that are off limits. So number 1, first, there are animals, land animals like the camel, the pig and the rabbit are considered unclean before God. This is verses 4 to 8 of chapter 11. So what does that mean? It means no pork, no bacon. All right? I'm sure you're feeling happy about living this side of the cross at the moment. Next, seafood. No prawns, no lobster. The only food we're allowed to eat from the ocean are fish with fins and scales. That's verses 9 to 12. Then birds, the only kind of birds we're allowed to eat are non-carrion birds. The carnivorous birds like the eagle and the kite and the vulture, they were unclean. Can't eat them in Israel. And then number 4, insects. All insects except for locusts were unclean. That's verses 20 to 23. You were not allowed to eat cockroaches back then. Now, the purpose of the food laws was to show that Israel was different to the nations. Okay, they were holy, they were set apart to the Lord. Now what that meant was every time an Israelite put food in their mouth, they were showing not only their obedience to God, but also their holiness. All right, the Jewish diet, the kosher diet, marked the Israelites out as God's holy people. They were different to the rest of the nations. So that's the beginning of the cleanliness laws. It gets a bit more difficult from there on in. So Leviticus 12, we didn't read this, but Leviticus 12 tells us that when you give birth to a baby, you are unclean. Now what does that mean? It means any new mothers were not allowed to go to the tabernacle for 40 days if they had a baby boy, or for 80 days if they had a baby girl. Now, like most of the cleanliness laws, we are not told why the difference between a baby boy and a baby girl. We just don't know. We don't want to read too much into it. But they were not allowed to go to the temple or the tabernacle after they gave birth. Leviticus 13 and 14, we just read some of that, talks about infectious skin diseases like rashes, as well as mold on your clothing or mold in your house. And these are things that made you unclean. And then Leviticus 15 outlines a whole bunch of bodily discharges that make a person unclean. Now this means this includes a woman's monthly period, it includes a nocturnal emission of semen, and it includes sexual intercourse. Okay? And any time, this is what we need to understand about this, any time any of these things happened to an Israelite, they were ritually unclean for a period of time. Now that period of time might have been a day, a week, a month, or until, things like the mold or the infectious skin disease was gone. And while you were unclean, you weren't allowed near the tabernacle. You weren't allowed near God. Right? Some even had to live, as we saw, some even had to live outside the camp so as to not contaminate other people with their ritual uncleanness. Now, there's two things I want to note about this. All right? The first is, while the Israelites could control what went in their mouth, the rest of the cleanliness laws were pretty much out of their control. Right? Pretty much everything in 12 to 15 were things that happened to the Israelites that they had no control over. Right? There's no avoidance laws in chapters 12 to 15 because you could not avoid most of the things that made you unclean. It wasn't a matter of sin here. Okay? But secondly, these laws meant that the average Israelite was ritually unclean several times a month. So while things like childbirth or mold in your house, they're not regular occurrences, all right? Women were ritually unclean every month. But let me read it to you. It gets even more interesting than this. So this is, if you wanted to flick over to Leviticus 15, verse 19, let me read it to you. It's a couple of pages. It says this: when a woman has her regular flow of blood, the impurity of her monthly period will last 7 days, and anyone who touches her will be unclean till evening. Well, on top of that, if you touch a woman's bed or a woman's seat that she's sitting on, you become unclean as well. All right? Now what this means is, unless you had a spare room where your poor mum or your poor big sister could isolate for 7 days, pretty much the whole family was unclean whenever an adult female had her period in the Israelite household. All right? Now add to that sexual intercourse within marriage, not to mention the fact that kids are little disease magnets. They come home with rashes all the time, do they not? All right? And what that meant was that the average Israelite family was considered ritually unclean and therefore in need of a ritual cleansing somewhere between a quarter to a half of the time. Right? Israelites were always having ritual baths because they were always unclean. Right? These cleanliness laws were a staggering burden on the people of Israel. A staggering burden. Now, the big question we need to ask is, why? All right? Why did God place such a staggering burden on his people? Like when we went through this list in Bible study this week, one of the people in Bible study said, look, this would potentially turn me off God if I had to follow these things all the time. And that statement shows that that person understands the burden, the weight of these laws. They are staggering burden. So why? Well, the reason the Israelites were constantly washing themselves ceremonially was a reminder that they were inherently unclean. They were inherently sinful. You see, sin, we need to understand this, sin is not the bad things we do. That's sins, plural. Right? Capital S sin is a state of uncleanness that every human has had since Genesis 3. We've inherited it through our parents, every single one of us. Now, this does not mean that little babies are as evil and wicked as Hitler, all right? But what it means is we all come from the factory with this inbuilt propensity to sin. That's why you don't need to teach little children how to lie, do you? You don't need to teach little children how to be greedy either. They figure those things out all by themselves, do they not? Now, why is this? It's because we have inherited what theologians call original sin. The cleanliness laws were there to show people our desperate, desperate need for cleansing. Then along comes Jesus. And in John chapter 13, Jesus is having a special meal with his disciples. It's called the Last Supper. All right? And after supper, Jesus takes off his outer clothing and he puts an apron on and he starts to wash his disciples' feet. Now, foot washing back then was pretty much the lowest job you could get. It was the job you gave your lowest of low slaves. All right. Now, the reason being that back then they didn't have covered shoes or socks. They had sandals, and they didn't have pavements. They had dirt roads, and so by the end of the day, your feet were really filthy. All right. Now, I don't like touching feet at the best of times. If my wife has had a shower and she goes and hangs the washing on the line, then comes back in and asks for a foot rub, I say, go and have another shower and wash your feet, please. Like, dirty feet are disgusting, all right? But here's Jesus washing the dirty feet of his disciples. Now, what the disciples don't realise is that foot washing was an enacted parable. It was an illustration of what Jesus was about to do the next day. He was about to serve them in an even more deeper and profound way on the cross. Now, because the disciples don't realise this, one of them, the disciple Peter, objects. He says, no, Master, you shall never wash my feet. Now, this was actually a mark of respect, all right? As the disciple, it was Peter that should have been washing Jesus' feet. But it's not about the foot washing, all right? It's about the cross. And so Jesus says this is John 13:8. Unless I wash you, you have no part with me. And what Jesus is saying is, remember all those cleanliness laws? You remember how you have to ritually bathe yourself and ritually wash your clothes and ritually clean your house all the time, several times a month, every month until the day you die, all right? You know how that's a big part of your life. The point of those laws, this is what Jesus is saying, the point of those laws is to show you that you cannot cleanse yourself. You need someone else to cleanse you. Now, I've used this illustration before, but it's a great way to understand what's going on here. There's this scene from the 5th Narnia book, The Voyage of the Dawn Treader, and it's a scene where their annoying cousin Eustace comes across a dragon's treasure, and he sees all this gold, and he covets the dragon's treasure, which actually turns him into a dragon. All right. To turn back into a boy, Aslan, the Jesus figure, says he needs to be washed. But before he can be washed, he needs to undress. That means taking his scaly layer of skin off. So what does Eustace do? He pulls the top layer of skin off, which comes off easily enough, but there was another scaly layer underneath that. And so he peels that away too. And again, 4 or 5 times. No impact. Finally, Aslan says, you have to let me undress you. And so Eustace lays back and allows Aslan to do his work. Eustace describes it by saying, the very first tear he made was so deep, I thought it had gone right into my heart. And when he began pulling my skin off, it hurt worse than anything I've ever felt before. The only thing that made me able to bear it was just the pleasure of feeling the stuff peel off. Friends, the purpose of these dead boring and staggeringly burdensome cleanliness laws was to show us that our meagre efforts of washing our bodies, of washing our clothes, of cleaning our house, of following God's word, doing good deeds, none of them can actually cleanse us. Right? The reason God chose things like skin rashes and mold and monthly periods and sexual intercourse with your spouse, these are good things, all right? The reason he shows them as things that make a person ritually unclean is to show us our inherent uncleanness before a holy God and how that inherent uncleanness is beyond our control. Right? We have all inherited this condition called original sin from Adam and Eve. And the only way to cure it is to be washed by Jesus. And this is actually the hardest part about becoming a Christian. See, the thing that stops most people from turning to Jesus is their inability to admit that they're unclean, that they're sinful. Most people prefer to think we can save ourselves. Most people prefer to think that we've contributed to our salvation in some way. I'm a good person, I'm a moral person, I'm a religious person. And look, you can understand that, can't you? Admitting you're a sinful wretch who cannot wash yourself, that's a big call to make. But friends, when we can muster up the humility to just lie back and let Jesus peel our scaly layer of skin off, the pleasure that comes is beyond compare. Right? It means hearing Jesus say the same thing that he said to Peter. All right? So when Jesus said, "Unless I wash you, you have no part in me," Peter, in his usual bombastic self, said, "Well, Lord, not just my feet, but my hands and my head as well." And Jesus then says this is John 13:10. "Those who have had a bath need only wash their feet. Their whole body is clean, and you are clean." Friends, when we admit our desperate need for cleansing and allow Jesus to cleanse us through the cross, we are completely clean. All right, that great hymn, "It is well with my soul," says this: "My sin, oh, the bliss of this glorious thought, my sin, not in part, but the whole, is nailed to the cross. I bear it no more. Praise the Lord, oh my soul." Well, this leaves one final question. How do we live once we've been cleansed by Jesus? Well, I'll tell you what we don't do. We don't continue to obey the cleanliness laws. Let me explain. The reason is very simple, all right? The whole purpose of the cleanliness laws was to point to our need for Jesus to cleanse us, all right? Under the Old Testament law, you were ritually bathing 5, 10, 20 times a month, and most of it was out of our control, all right? The purpose of the cleanliness laws was to point to our need for Jesus to cleanse us. And if Jesus has washed us clean through his death on the cross, then we dare not go back to keep following these cleanliness laws. Right? If the purpose of the cleanliness laws was to be a huge, bright, neon flashing sign to Jesus, and Jesus has come and washed his people, then following the cleanliness laws now as Christians is actually a form of blasphemy. And do you know what blasphemy is? It's the opposite of honouring God, of using God's name in an honouring way. It's dragging God down. And that's what we do if we continue to follow the cleanliness laws in Leviticus. Why? Because we're saying Jesus' cleansing of me was not enough. Only part of my sin was nailed to the cross. All right? And that's why we dare not obey these laws this side of the cross. Right? Jesus himself tells us this in Acts chapter 10. He comes to the Apostle Peter in a vision where, you remember this, a large white sheet comes down in front of the Apostle Peter full of all kinds of animals, and Jesus says, "Get up, kill and eat." And Peter says, "Surely not, Lord, I have never eaten anything unclean or impure." Peter has followed the cleanliness laws in Leviticus his whole life. And 3 times Jesus says to Peter, "Do not call anything impure that God has made clean." So friends, we need to understand this. Christians are not cherry picking when we no longer obey the cleanliness laws of Leviticus 11 to 15. We're actually following the purpose of the cleanliness laws in no longer obeying the cleanliness laws. We're saying the purpose of the cleanliness laws have been fulfilled in Jesus, and therefore it would be wrong, it would be blasphemous for me to continue to obey them. All right? Thanks to Jesus, Christians are now free from the burden of these cleanliness laws. All right? So that's what we don't do. What do we do? Well, about 2 minutes after Peter has that vision in Acts chapter 10, there's a knock at his door. And he goes and opens the door, and there's a bunch of Gentiles standing there. Now, Gentiles were, for the first century Jew, Gentiles were unclean. They were the ones who ate pork, all right? And these food laws in Leviticus 11 made it virtually impossible for Jews to associate with Gentiles. Yet Peter has just been reminded 3 times, has been punched into him 3 times, do not call anything impure that God has made clean. And so what does Peter do? He goes with the Gentiles to enter a house full of Gentiles and tell these Gentiles the gospel. It's the first time the gospel goes to people outside of Israel. Now, the point of that episode in Acts chapter 10 is to declare that the dividing line between Jews and Gentiles is now gone. God no longer just chooses people who obey the food laws and the cleanliness laws. He doesn't just choose people from Israel. He chooses people from all nations. Now, how does that affect you and me? Well, it means you and I are not allowed to look down on other cultures anymore either. All right? We cannot claim that other cultures or other races or other traditions are inferior to ours. We cannot claim and demand, that people from other cultures become like us if they want to join our church. And we cannot look at certain people or certain races as beyond saving. It's pointless preaching the gospel to them, they'll never come around. You can't say that. All right? The cleanliness laws were there to show the Israelites how to be holy. This is Leviticus 11:45. Be holy because I am holy. But Jesus has changed all that by making all things clean. Now here's the thing. Jesus did not fulfill the cleanliness laws to make pork clean so that we can eat pork now. Jesus fulfilled the cleanliness laws because we are the pork. And we are now clean. So Christians dare not look down on other races or cultures because Jesus died for them, just like he died for us. Right? Now that's not to say there's no place for critiquing certain behaviours or practices in different cultures if they don't align with God's word. But how Christians live in the wonderful freedom of being cleansed is remembering that our cleansing is by grace, just like everyone else's. And that's how you answer those who frivolously charge Christians with cherry picking. Now, it's not a simple answer, unfortunately, which is why even very smart people like President Bartlett kept getting it wrong, all right? But my prayer is that we as Christians know that to follow the cleanliness laws this side of the cross means to not obey them. For that would bring Jesus down. May we rather rest in Jesus' death and that has brought us cleansing for all the nations.